Hello everyone, and welcome to part 1 of our in-depth exploration of Trump 2.0's foreign policy vision. In today's video, we'll dive into how a potential Trump administration could reshape global order. We'll cover topics ranging from America First versus the old order, and a new transactional approach to alliances, to shifts in NATO, Europe, and Russia, along with a retreat from multilateral institutions, a bold trade policy, a reformed energy and climate agenda, and the dynamics of great power competition. Let's get started. For over 70 years after World War II, U.S. foreign policy was anchored in a rules-based international order. During that time, the U.S. led alliances such as NATO, upheld multilateral institutions, and acted as a global enforcer of norms. A second Trump administration promises a sharp departure from this tradition. The guiding doctrine is America First, which prioritizes U.S. sovereignty and interests over international commitments. Trump openly rejects the notion of the U.S. as the world's ATM or policeman and signals a decreased willingness to underwrite global security unless it directly benefits America. Under Trump 2.0, Washington would likely de-emphasize the post-war ethos of collective action and instead embrace a more unilateral and transactional approach. Trump's advisors themselves contrast his vision with Reagan-era internationalism. Whereas Reagan championed optimism, alliances, and free trade, the Trump camp is nationalist and protectionist in outlook. In practice, this means that U.S. global leadership would be scaled back and made more conditional. One analysis notes that Europe and the U.S. under Trump now hold very different views of alliances. While Europe still sees the U.S. as the indispensable security guarantor, a Trump-led America would view Europe as a lower priority and expect it to fend for itself. This collapse of the old bipartisan consensus on alliances marks a potential end to the U.S.'s role as leader of the free world. Trump's America First approach emphasizes national interests and skepticism of global institutions. In his own words, alliances and deals are only valuable if they are, in his view, fair and advantageous to the U.S. Otherwise, friends must step up or face America stepping back. This philosophy implies a world where U.S. engagement is no longer taken for granted. The following sections break down how a Trump 2.0 administration could reshape U.S. strategy across alliances, institutions, trade, and great power relations. Trump's first term gave a preview of his alliance policy by demanding that allies pay more and even questioning U.S. treaty commitments. In a second term, NATO and other alliances would face unprecedented pressure to pull their weight. Trump has already informed NATO countries that they should spend 5% of their GDP on defense, which is far above the current 2% target. He repeatedly blasted NATO as obsolete and reportedly told aides that NATO is dead, raising doubts about whether the U.S. would honor NATO's mutual defense pledge. While it is uncertain if Trump would actually withdraw from NATO, experts warn that even without a formal pullout, NATO might not survive intact under Trump's demands. In exchange for continued U.S. participation, Trump is expected to insist on drastic increases in defense spending and to accept a radical reorientation of NATO's structure. That reorientation would shift much of the alliance's burden onto Europe. According to Trump-aligned defense planners, the U.S. would retain its nuclear umbrella and some forces in Europe, while ground combat units and logistics responsibilities would largely become Europe's burden. In essence, Washington would step back and act only as support in dire crises rather than serving as the primary defender on the continent. A Trump 2.0 team has even floated the concept of a two-tier NATO in which allies that failed to meet defense spending targets would not enjoy a full U.S. security guarantee. This approach directly undermines NATO's Article 5 on collective defense. Although Trump advisors note that the language of Article 5, stating that the U.S. may take such action as it deems necessary, provides leeway to limit U.S. obligations. All of this signals a break from the post-1945 norm in which the U.S. firmly committed to defending its allies regardless of their contributions. In East Asia, a similar transactional alliance policy is expected. Trump has called U.S. treaty allies like South Korea free riders. At one rally, he derided South Korea as a money machine that should pay tenfold more for U.S. protection. During his 2024 campaign, he suggested that U.S. troops might be withdrawn from Korea or Japan if those nations do not vastly increase host nation support. This possibility has unnerved both Seoul and Tokyo. However, Trump is also keenly aware of the need to deter both China and North Korea. Many Republican defense hawks concede that U.S. alliances with Japan and South Korea remain fundamental to countering China. As a result, Trump's approach to Asia would likely mix hard pressure on Asian allies to pay more and buy more American arms with a realpolitik recognition that U.S. forward bases in Japan, Korea, and even the relationship with Taiwan are strategic assets. Trump's unpredictability, however, will keep allies on edge. In his first term, he showed a willingness to break protocol, for example by holding unprecedented summits with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. He touts his personal deal-making as an asset in both alliance management and adversary relations. As a result, allies may seek to curry personal favor. For instance, South Korea's president quickly congratulated Trump on his 2024 win and even took up golf as a way to bond with him. Similarly, Japan's leadership recalls how former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's charm offensive helped manage Trump's mercurial behavior. In short, alliances under Trump 2.0 would hinge less on institutional trust and more on transactional deals and personal rapport, which is a sharp departure from the steady, principle-based partnerships of previous presidencies. The transatlantic relationship is poised for especially dramatic change. Traditional U.S. policy cast America as the linchpin of European security and staunchly opposed Russian aggression. Trump, by contrast, has long questioned that role. He has openly admired Vladimir Putin and even suggested that the U.S. should not automatically defend every NATO ally. One famous remark involved him musing that tiny Montenegro could start World War III. In a second term, Trump's priority regarding Europe would be to end the Russia-Ukraine war quickly, even if that means pressuring Kyiv into a peace deal favorable to Moscow. Trump has vowed to stop the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours of taking office, a sign that he might push Ukraine to accept a ceasefire and territorial losses as the price of peace. Multiple reports indicate that Trump is considering a grand bargain with Putin. Under such a deal, the U.S. would halt further NATO expansion, specifically barring Ukraine and Georgia from joining, and perhaps recognize Russian control of occupied Ukrainian territories such as Crimea and parts of Donbass. Trump's own campaign rhetoric reinforces this idea. He said that offering Ukraine NATO membership was a mistake and insinuated that that promise provoked the war. In effect, Trump appears willing to reverse key elements of post-Cold War U.S. policy by acknowledging a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. One Trump-aligned Heritage Foundation leader even expects a very quick deal to end the conflict if Trump takes office. Such a deal would upend the principle that nations choose their own alliances. But Trump's circle argues that it represents a pragmatic reset. One Trump advisor noted that Trump would be open to foregoing NATO expansion and would not insist that Russia retreat to pre-2014 borders. However, they insist that this would not necessarily mean abandoning Ukraine entirely. For instance, the U.S. could continue supplying weapons even as it brokers a truce. Still, European leaders fear that U.S. military aid to Ukraine could be drastically cut or ended altogether, thereby removing the backbone of Ukraine's resistance. Indeed, Trump has lambasted the scale of aid sent under Biden, and his advisors talk of shifting from burden sharing to burden shifting, meaning that Europe would largely be left to deal with Russia on its own. A hallmark of Trump's vision is deep skepticism, even hostility, toward multilateral institutions that have underpinned the liberal international order. We can expect a Trump 2.0 White House to withdraw from or defund various global organizations that it sees as constraining U.S. sovereignty or as not aligning with the America First orientation. During his first term, Trump repeatedly disparaged the United Nations and its agencies. He pulled the U.S. out of UNESCO and the UN Human Rights Council, slashed contributions to UN climate programs, and scorned the UN as a bloated bureaucracy. His view is that international bodies should have no say over U.S. policies. He argued that institutions such as the International Criminal Court and even the UN itself undermine national sovereignty, and he refused to be bound by many of their decisions. In a second term, Trump is likely to continue unbankrolling the UN. As Heritage Foundation analysts bluntly put it, there would be no more underwriting of the UN's globalist agenda unless it aligns with U.S. interests. This could mean cutting U.S. funding for UN peacekeeping and development agencies, using the threat of a U.S. exit as leverage for reforms, or simply disengaging from multilateral diplomacy altogether. For example, Trump could again pull the U.S. out of the World Health Organization. In 2020, he already froze WHO funding and began the process to withdraw, accusing the WHO of mismanaging the COVID-19 pandemic and of kowtowing to China. Although Biden reversed that withdrawal, Trump has not changed his stance. He maintains that the WHO failed in handling COVID and that the U.S. should not pay the lion's share of its budget. It is very plausible that Trump 2.0 would formally exit the WHO and redirect global health funds elsewhere or use them as bargaining chips. Similarly, we should expect continued confrontation with the World Trade Organization. Trump has called the WTO a disaster and threatened to withdraw from it, accusing the organization of unfairly empowering China and other nations at America's expense. During his first term, he effectively paralyzed the WTO's dispute court by blocking judge appointments. In his second term, Trump might go further, possibly pulling the U.S. out of the WTO entirely if his demands are not met. He has argued that WTO rules and China's developing country status disadvantage the U.S., and he vowed to terminate any special WTO privileges for China. The implication is that the U.S. would retreat from the multilateral trading system in favor of bilateral power politics, using tariffs and deals on its own terms. This approach is a sharp break from the post-war norm of U.S. leadership in multilateral institutions. Traditionally, even when imperfect, Washington worked within bodies such as the UN, WTO, WHO, and the World Bank, IMF, seeing them as tools to advance a rules-based order. Trump, on the other hand, views many of these bodies as useless or even inimical to U.S. interests. His administration would prioritize U.S. freedom of action over global rulemaking. This could mean vetoing UN initiatives that do not align with America First, sidelining climate and human rights forums, and favoring ad hoc coalitions of willing partners rather than established institutions. One expert noted that Trump's approach calls for reducing international engagement to only a handful of countries, with a limited set of priorities guiding the State Department. Indeed, a Heritage Foundation blueprint called Project 2025 envisages recalling or firing diplomats who are too multilateralist and tying foreign aid strictly to U.S. strategic goals. All of this points to an American posture that is far less involved in global governance. A U.S. that participates in the UN, WTO, or other institutions only on a transactional, case-by-case basis, if at all. One of the clearest deviations of Trump's vision from past U.S. policy is in trade and globalization. Previous administrations largely upheld free trade agreements and worked through multilateral frameworks like the WTO. Trump's America First economics, however, emphasizes tariffs, the renegotiation of deals, and decoupling from rivals. In a second term, Trump 2.0 would double down on the protectionist turn seen in his first term. Notably, he has proposed imposing a blanket 10% tariff on virtually all imports into the United States, sometimes described as a universal tariff. He has also threatened 60% punitive tariffs on Chinese goods and suggested revoking China's permanent most favored nation trade status. Such moves would represent an escalation of the U.S.-China trade war into an open economic decoupling. Trump asserts that these actions are necessary to eliminate U.S. dependence on China in critical sectors. His campaign claims it would completely eliminate dependence on China in all critical areas within 4 years by targeting Chinese electronics, steel, pharmaceuticals, and other products, even if that disrupts global supply chains. Under Trump 2.0, we should anticipate a harder line on trade with allies as well. In his first term, Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership on his first day in office, renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, and imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the EU, Canada, and others. A second term might bring new tariffs on allies under the rationale of national security or to force better terms. For example, Trump has floated the idea of raising tariffs on automobile imports from Europe and Japan, a threat he has used before. His team also hints at pressing allies such as Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, countries with trade surpluses relative to the U.S., to reduce imbalances or face tariffs. Even close partners could be affected. South Korea has already voiced anxiety after Trump demanded a 20% tariff on all U.S. trading partners, a move that would hurt Korean exports. Crucially, Trump prefers bilateral deals over large multilateral agreements. Do not expect the U.S. to join any new free trade bloc. Indeed, Trump refers to Biden's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as TPP-2 and has threatened to scrap it. Instead, he may seek one-on-one deals where he believes America has leverage. For instance, a long-discussed U.S.-UK trade agreement could be revisited, as Trump was a Brexit supporter and might find political symbiosis with Britain. However, even those deals would be negotiated from the stance of maximizing U.S. advantage, potentially at the expense of its allies. In summary, Trump's trade vision rejects the liberalizing trends of the past. It embraces tariffs as a routine tool. As he once quipped, an eye for an eye, a tariff for a tariff, and views import substitution and reshoring as economic imperatives. This signals a break from the U.S.'s post-WWII role as a champion of free trade and global growth. Instead, the U.S. would likely become a tougher and more unpredictable trading partner, willing to breach norms such as WTO rules to protect its industries and reduce its deficits. Allies in both Europe and Asia worry about this approach, since many are export-dependent and have benefited from stable U.S.-led trading rules. Under Trump 2.0, they could face a more confrontational U.S. trade stance that might even force them to choose between access to the U.S. market and maintaining ties with China. The global trading system itself could fragment further if the U.S. abandons its traditional leadership role at the WTO. Energy policy is another arena where Trump's approach diverges sharply from recent U.S. norms. He has promised American energy dominance by prioritizing the production of oil, gas, and coal without regard for climate change initiatives. In a second term, Trump would likely reverse many of Biden's climate policies and withdraw the U.S. once again from the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump 2.0 would mean that the world loses U.S. leadership on climate issues, as the U.S. would once again withdraw from the Paris Agreement and roll back regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. On the 2024 campaign trail, Trump embraced the slogan, "Drill, baby, drill," vowing to unleash domestic fossil fuel output and slash consumer energy prices. While his claims, such as cutting gas prices by 50%, may be exaggerated, his intent is clear: to boost oil and gas production, end Green New Deal programs, and make the U.S. a top energy exporter. This energy dominance doctrine has significant foreign policy implications. Trump's team frames it as a way to undercut rivals and assist allies. More U.S. oil and liquefied natural gas on the market can reduce Europe's reliance on Russian gas and weaken petrostates such as Iran and Venezuela. Some commentators argue that killing overly green policies can hurt America's foes by depriving them of a fuel monopoly. We can expect a Trump administration to champion fossil fuels globally, possibly pressuring allies to buy American energy and criticizing European green initiatives as naive. In the realm of great power rivalry, chiefly between the U.S., China, and Russia, a Trump 2.0 strategy would be complex. On one hand, Trump identifies China as America's paramount competitor and has pledged an even tougher line against Beijing. On the other hand, he has shown an unusual affinity for Russia's Putin and a willingness to cut deals that traditional policymakers would avoid. The net effect would be a U.S. posture that is less about defending a liberal order and more about raw competition and deal-making among great powers. When it comes to China, Trump's first term launched a trade war with China and a broader strategic confrontation. In a second term, that competition would escalate dramatically. Trump has said he will impose tariffs ranging from 60% to 100% on all imports from China, a move that would undoubtedly trigger economic warfare and deepen the rift between Washington and Beijing. He has also talked about banning U.S. investment in China and forcing a decoupling of supply chains for critical goods. This goes beyond trade. It represents economic containment. Trump and his advisors argue that aggressive action is needed to stop China's economic abuses and to protect American industry. For example, Trump promises to phase out U.S. imports of essential products from China, such as electronics, steel, and pharmaceuticals, and bring that manufacturing back home. On the technology front, Trump would continue efforts to deny China access to advanced tech. During his first term, his administration began blocking China's telecom giant Huawei and restricting chip technology exports. Although Biden has since tightened those controls, Trump is likely to push even harder. This could include a total ban on selling semiconductor technology to China and strong-arming allies such as South Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, and Japan to do the same. The goal is to hobble China's rise in artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, and other advanced fields. A second Trump term might also see more aggressive diplomatic and military moves to counter China. For instance, challenging Chinese claims in the South China Sea, expanding military ties with India and Vietnam, and strongly backing Taiwan even though Trump's personal commitment to Taiwan has been inconsistent since he often complains that Taiwan should pay more for its own defense. Notably, Trump rarely emphasizes democratic values or human rights in China. Issues such as Hong Kong or the treatment of Uyghurs received relatively little support beyond the imposition of sanctions. Thus, the competition is framed in terms of power and economics rather than as an ideological crusade. His officials state that strategic competition will remain the organizing principle of U.S. defense strategy with China as the pacing threat. We should expect a confrontational stance toward Beijing across trade, technology, and military domains that could lead to a further downward spiral in U.S.-China relations. Trump himself is not an ideologue. He has praised President Xi as a friend and admired his authoritarian grip. Yet many in Trump's orbit consider the Chinese Communist Party an existential threat. This tension means that Trump's China policy could oscillate between a bellicose stance involving tariffs, sanctions, and naval posturing, and moments of attempted deal-making if he believes he can secure a bigger, better trade deal than before. Still, the dominant theme remains decoupling and competition, as evidenced by his promises to end U.S. dependence on China and to pressure allies to de-link from Chinese technology investments. Regarding Russia, in contrast with his stance on China, Trump's approach is expected to be less confrontational and even accommodating. He has consistently downplayed the Russian threat, questioned U.S. sanctions on Russia, and shown a lukewarm attitude toward NATO's posture against Moscow. In a second term, as discussed, he might actively seek a détente, aiming for rapid peace in Ukraine, even if that peace favors Russia, and seeking an understanding with Putin regarding Europe's security framework. Trump has also hinted that he could recognize some of Russia's claims, for example by suggesting that defending Ukraine's full sovereignty is not an absolute U.S. imperative. This would mark a stark shift from the traditional U.S. role of containing Russia. It might involve relaxing some sanctions on Russia as part of a Ukraine deal, or at least refraining from imposing new ones. It could also involve constraining NATO to mollify Moscow, for instance, freezing NATO's enlargement or even pulling certain U.S. assets out of Europe. However, Trump also likes to project strength, so he may couple any compromise with Putin with loud threats if Russia steps out of line. Notably, some experts caution that Putin should not simply rejoice at Trump's win because Trump's unpredictability could just as easily lead to harsh reactions if Putin embarrasses him or overreaches. For example, if Putin ignored Trump's peace overtures and tried to take all of Ukraine, Trump might feel compelled to respond forcefully in order to avoid looking weak. In essence, Trump's Russia policy could swing between an attempted partnership, unlike any seen since the end of the Cold War, and sudden bouts of toughness, a volatility that itself breaks from the more steady and adversarial stance of previous administrations. That concludes Part 1 of our deep dive into the potential Trump 2.0 foreign policy. Today, we explored the shift from a rules-based international order to an America-first approach, covering alliances, military commitments, multilateral institutions, trade, energy, and the dynamics of great power competition. Stay tuned for Part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the implications of these changes and what they mean for global stability. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.